Night settles over Shanhai Pass. Cold air moves along the stone. Torches flicker against walls that have not fallen in 2 centuries. The gates are closed. Heavy timber, iron reinforced, built to withstand armies. For more than 200 years, the gates never moved. Nomadic raids came and went. Siege attempts tested the frontier. Still, the gates never moved. On this night, there is no battle forming outside. No drums, no war cries, no ladders rising toward the battlements. Beyond the wall, an army waits. Disciplined, ordered, silent. They do not advance. They wait. Inside the pass, soldiers stand in uneasy silence. Rumors have already reached them. Beijing is unstable. Rebels are marching. The emperor is losing control. But here, the wall still stands. The signal towers still burn. Everything appears secure. Then, a decision is made. No explosion follows. No desperate resistance. Only the sound of wood shifting against wood. The hinges begin to move. The gates open. From the inside, the army beyond the wall steps forward. Not charging, not shouting, walking. And with that quiet movement, the strongest empire on earth begins to collapse. The wall remains standing. The stone does not crack. But the dynasty behind it is already dying. Because what happened here was not defeat. It was permission.
At its height, the Ming Empire did not look fragile. It looked inevitable. Shipyards along the coast produced vessels so large that foreign observers struggled to describe them. Massive wooden hulls stretched across harbors, their masts rising like forests against the sky. These were not defensive ships built in desperation. They were declarations of confidence. Trade routes connected continents. Porcelain moved west in staggering quantities. Silk followed, and in return, silver flowed back into Chinese markets in rivers so steady that entire provinces measured prosperity by its weight. Beijing stood at the center of this machine, a city of walls within walls, gates within gates, courtyards lined with officials trained through years of examination and ritual. Thousands competed for positions in a bureaucracy that recorded harvests, population counts, tax obligations, and military inventories with obsessive precision. Nothing seemed accidental. Granaries were stocked against famine. Arsenals manufactured gunpowder weapons in controlled quantities. Messenger routes connected frontier outposts to the capital in days, sometimes hours. Even the wall itself was a masterpiece of willpower. Thousands of kilometers of stone placed across mountain ridges, not because it was easy, but because it was difficult. It was meant to signal permanence, to project strength not only outward, but inward, to reassure. For generations, it worked. Raids were contained, borders stabilized. The empire endured. From a distance, the system appeared unshakable. And that is what makes what happened next so unsettling. Because empires this large do not collapse overnight. They erode. Quietly, under pressure that most people never see.
The first cracks did not appear in stone. They appeared in people. Along the northern frontier, winters grew harsher. Wind cut through uniforms never designed for endless cold. Supplies arrived late, if they arrived at all. Soldiers stationed along remote towers began to ration their own food, stretching what little grain they had into thin porridge that barely held through the night. Letters sent to families went unanswered. Pay was delayed, then delayed again. Some guards sold personal belongings to buy firewood. Others hunted in forbidden areas just to survive. The wall still stood, but the men who defended it were growing tired. Farther south, farmers felt the pressure first. Harvests shrank. Floods destroyed fields in one province, while drought burned another. Families that had once stored grain for winter began selling tools to buy rice. When the tools were gone, they sold livestock. When livestock was gone, they sold land. When land was gone, they left. Entire villages emptied slowly, not from invasion, but from exhaustion. Rumors traveled faster than official reports. In marketplaces, whispers replaced confidence. Taxes felt heavier. Officials felt distant. The empire that once seemed omnipresent now felt far away. Even the frontier towers sensed it. Signal fires still burned at night, but responses took longer. Reinforcements that once arrived swiftly began to stall. The system was still functioning, but it was no longer strong. It was straining. And strain, when left unattended, becomes fracture. In some garrisons, commanders stopped reporting shortages entirely. Admitting weakness felt more dangerous than hiding it. So official records remained clean. On paper, rations were distributed. On paper, salaries were paid. On paper, the frontier was secure. Reality looked different. Men, weakened by hunger, stood watch for hours, staring into darkness that felt endless. Some deserted quietly. Others remained, not out of loyalty, but because there was nowhere left to go. In the countryside, desperation hardened. Groups of displaced farmers began traveling together for protection. What began as migration slowly turned into something else. Anger, organized anger. They no longer blamed weather, they blamed officials. They blamed distant administrators who never saw empty bowls or frozen fields. The empire still spoke in the language of stability, but its people were beginning to speak in the language of survival. It did not begin as an army. It began as a handful of men who refused to starve quietly. In a remote province, a dismissed postal worker named Li Zicheng gathered farmers who had lost land, tools, and patience. At first, they were little more than a wandering group of displaced peasants, moving from town to town in search of food. Local officials dismissed them. Bandits, they said. The empire had dealt with bandits before. But this time, something was different. The men following Li were not merely hungry, they were organized. They moved with purpose. They avoided fortified cities at first, targeting supply depots and isolated garrisons. Each small success brought more recruits. Farmers joined, laborers joined, discharged soldiers joined. What had started as a desperate migration slowly hardened into rebellion. Word spread faster than imperial reports could travel. In villages where taxes had grown unbearable, doors opened willingly. In towns where officials had grown complacent, resistance collapsed quickly. By the time the capital understood the scale of the movement, it was no longer a local disturbance. It was an advancing force. Cities fell in succession. Garrisons surrendered without major resistance. Some commanders calculated survival over loyalty. Others simply fled. The rebellion moved northward like a storm front, gathering strength with each province it crossed. Inside Beijing, confidence began to fracture. Court factions blamed one another. Reports contradicted each other. The emperor issued orders, but orders require men willing to carry them out. And those men were exhausted. The wall still stood in the distance, but the threat was no longer approaching from beyond it. It was rising from within. At Shanhai Pass stood General Wu Sangui. He was not a minor officer on a forgotten frontier. He commanded one of the most critical gateways of the empire. Behind him lay Beijing. Ahead of him waited the Manchu army. For years, Wu had defended the northern border with discipline and reputation. He understood the wall. He understood the terrain. He understood the enemy beyond it. What he did not expect was collapse from within. When news reached him that rebel forces had entered the capital, it carried more than political consequence. His family was there. Parents, servants, concubines, children, all inside a city now controlled by men who had risen from hunger and rage. Reports were chaotic. Some said the emperor was still alive. Others said he had taken his own life. Smoke was seen above the forbidden city. Looting had begun. The old order was dissolving by the hour. Wu Sangui now faced a narrowing set of choices. If he marched south to confront the rebels, he would leave the pass exposed. The Manchu army would cross into the heartland unopposed. If he remained at the wall, the rebels would consolidate power in Beijing, and his family would remain in their hands. Messengers traveled between camps. Negotiations were whispered. Promises were made. The Manchus offered alliance. Together, they said, the rebels could be crushed. Together, order could be restored. It sounded like survival. It sounded like necessity. But survival for whom? The wall stood silent around him. Stone does not advise, it only endures. Wu Sangui had sworn loyalty to the Ming. He had built his career on defending it. Now he stood between two armies, both enemies in different ways. And time was shrinking. The longer he waited, the fewer choices remained. On the surface, it looked like desperation. A man trying to save his family, a commander trying to prevent chaos. That is how history often remembers moments like this. But decisions are rarely made in panic. They are made in calculation. Dawn had not yet broken over Shanhai Pass. The sky was pale, but not yet bright. Wind moved along the stone battlements, carrying with it the distant smell of smoke from the capital. Wu Sangui had listened carefully to every offer. He had weighed the risks with patience. He had measured the cost not only in territory, but in power. Behind him, the empire he had sworn to defend was unraveling hour by hour. Ahead of him, the Manchu army waited with discipline and unsettling calm. They did not threaten him. They did not rush him. They understood something he also understood. Time was no longer working in the Ming Dynasty's favor. Inside the pass, Ming soldiers stood at their posts, believing they were guarding the border from invasion. They did not know that the border itself was about to change. Orders began to move quietly through the chain of command, not shouted, not proclaimed, delivered with composure. The gates were to be opened. No speech was given to justify the action, no explanation offered to the men who would lift the beams. Heavy wooden braces were removed from their brackets. Iron hinges groaned under weight they had carried for generations. For a moment, the structure resisted. Then it moved. A narrow line of light appeared between the doors. It widened slowly. The wall did not crumble. It obeyed. Manchu banners advanced at a controlled pace. Boots struck stone in steady rhythm. Armor shifted with restrained confidence. Not invaders smashing defenses, invited allies crossing a threshold. Together, they marched south. The rebels would be crushed. Beijing would be retaken. The capital would fall back into order, but not the old order. The Ming Dynasty ended not with a desperate last stand on the wall, but with a controlled decision made in silence. Wu Sangui did not appear frantic. He did not appear cornered. He appeared composed. The wall had been built to stop outsiders. On that morning, it performed exactly as instructed. It opened when commanded. And with that movement, 3 centuries of a new dynasty began. Empires do not always fall because enemies are stronger. Sometimes they fall because someone decides that the future lies on the other side of the gate. For centuries afterward, the wall continued to stand. Tourists would one day walk along its ridges and call it a symbol of strength. They would photograph its towers against the sky. They would admire the engineering. Few would think about the morning it opened. Fewer would think about the man who gave the order. Stone can project permanence. But permanence is not the same as stability. The Ming Dynasty believed its walls were enough. History suggests otherwise. Because the most dangerous threat to any empire is rarely outside its borders. It is the moment when loyalty shifts quietly and the gates move without resistance. If stories like this change the way you see history, subscribe and stay with us. And tell me in the comments, was Wu Sangui desperate, or did he already know which side would win?